The scripture this morning is from Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verses 1 through 8, and Matthew chapter 5, verses 1 through 4. There's a time for everything, and a season for every activity under the heavens. A time to be born, and a time to die. A time to plant, and a time to uproot. A time to kill, and a time to heal. A time to tear down, and a time to build. A time to weep, and a time to laugh. A time to mourn, and a time to dance. A time to scatter stones, and a time to gather them up. A time to embrace, and a time to refrain from embracing. A time to search, and a time to give up. A time to keep, and a time to throw away. A time to tear, and a time to mend. A time to be silent, and a time to speak. A time to love, and a time to hate. A time for war, and a time for peace. Matthew chapter 5, verse 1 through 4. Now when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and sat down. His disciples came to him, and he began to teach them. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. The word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God. Thank you, Jenny. Well, good morning again. And Pastor Jason sends his regards. He is actually at Sugar River United Methodist Church in Verona this morning. You may remember a couple weeks ago, Pastor Gary came and gave the sermon here on our Consecration Sunday. And last Sunday, I was at Mount Horeb giving their sermon for Consecration Sunday. And now Jason is in Sugar River for Sugar River's Consecration Sunday. So it's another way that our three congregations have been sharing in ministries together. So say a prayer for him as he shares a word with their congregation today. Another thing I want to just bring to your attention before I share my message is this read sheet in your bulletin. We believe that growing in faith is something that we do all week long, not just here on Sunday morning for a little bit. So if you want a little support with that, we have some questions for you to consider to go deeper into what I'll be sharing about today, and some prayers for you to take home and use throughout the week on the back of the sheet as well. So I encourage you to hang on to this as you leave today. Well, there is a saying you might have heard before, or some variation of it. Something like, the only thing that stays the same is that nothing stays the same, right? Something like that. It's kind of a trite saying, but it's also kind of true, isn't it? Something that we know, at least in our minds, that everything changes over time. The other day I was sitting with my book club, and we were just kind of chatting, and I said, you know, I feel like I've really noticed in the last couple of weeks how much I've just aged a lot. I noticed like gray hair is starting to come up and some new lines. And one of my friends laughed, and she said, you know, it's probably just that your son is getting old enough now that you actually have time to look in the mirror and notice something that's been happening the whole time. I laughed a little bit, and then she said, oh, but of course you look great. She didn't want to leave me hanging there. But oftentimes the changes in our life are like that, right? I mean, they start to change bit by bit, little by little. And it's not until we slow down and look in the mirror a little bit, take the reality in that we see what's really been happening all along. Other times, though, of course, change is more abrupt, more disruptive. Today, we will be remembering our loved ones who have died. And some of these beloved were taken from us unexpectedly, before we would have wanted them to go. Some of them were at the end of a long and productive and happy life. And then, of course, there are so many situations in between. But no matter how or when it happens, death is a change that rips the fabric of our lives as we know them. This time of year, I find, lends itself to a reflection on the reality of change in our lives. This is because the season can both be abrupt in its change, like we noticed this Halloween when suddenly we had several inches of snow on the ground, or gradual, like the minutes shaved off of the end of each day. There's a poem I love that I want to share a little bit of with you about this time of year. It's written by Mary Oliver, and it's called Lines Written in the Days of Growing Darkness. Every year we have been witness to it, how the world descends into a rich mash in order that it may resume. And therefore, who would cry out to the petals on the ground to stay, knowing as we must, how the vivacity of what was is married to the vitality of what will be. The vivacity of what was is married to the vitality of what will be. As I mentioned to the kids, we see in the cycle of the seasons put into action the scripture that Jenny read for us today from the book of Ecclesiastes. There is a season for everything. The petals must fall as the flowers lose their vivacity, their liveliness. They descend into a rich mash as they decompose, creating the fertile soil that allows new life to emerge in the springtime. The vitality of what will be. These things work hand in hand, what was and what will be. One must relinquish unto death for the other to emerge at all. I have to say, I don't always like this reality very much, though. When I read from Ecclesiastes, I usually want to keep one half of the phrase and get rid of the other half. So I like the sound of planting and healing and building up and laughing and dancing and mending and loving and making peace. I like all of that. And I'd rather just kind of ignore the uprooting, the killing, the tearing down, the weeping, the mourning, the tearing, the hating, and the waging war. I don't like that part. The next line in Mary Oliver's poem is, I don't say it's easy, but what else will do if the love one claims to have for the world be true? If we truly love this world that God has created, then we have to come to terms with these seeming contradictions. The parts of life we love and the parts of life sometimes we'd rather just ignore. Jesus talks a lot about this. In Luke chapter 9, he says, "For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world, yet lose or forfeit their very self?" There is something in the act of letting go, of those things that we cling to so tightly, that actually enables us to have real life, to embrace our very selves which are held securely in the grace of God, despite all else. In the second passage that we read today from the book of Matthew, we saw two lines which are part of a collection of sayings from Jesus called the Beatitudes, which you might be familiar with. Each of these 9 phrases starts with the line, "Blessed are," and then it goes on and turns on its head our assumptions about who is to be called blessed. Jesus doesn't describe blessing like you might see it in Instagram with #blessed, you know that thing. People put #blessed next to images of their new car or promotion announcement or smiling friends or engagement rings. #blessed. How could Jesus put that #blessed next to someone who is poor in spirit, someone who is mourning? We might say that these moments of change, death, mourning, loss, these cracks in our human experience that we'd really rather just ignore, are actually the places where Christ's presence can most clearly enter in. These are where opportunities to receive God's grace are most abundant, if we open our hearts to really see and accept the rich mash that is already developing at our feet. Jesus' life was full of these change moments, being the human being that he was. The most dramatic was, of course, the event of Good Friday. And some theologians say that it wasn't until he accepted his death on the cross, suffering as he did, that Christ fully entered and embraced our human experience. And we trust that Christ continues to embrace our human experience, especially in our suffering. In Galatians, Paul writes, "I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The life I now live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me." There was only ever one Jesus on the cross. We're not asked to be Jesus again. But like Paul, we are invited to embrace Christ living in us, the Christ who transforms life into death over and over again. In him we have hope. We can recognize these natural cycles of life and death as we experience them, little mini Easter resurrections every day, and know that this is where we can see Christ breaking into our human experience even more. We can see how the vivacity of what was is married to the vitality of what will be. As you celebrate Thanksgiving in just a few days, I encourage you to pause and to consider this moment in time. We gather together with family and friends in a season of abundance, the season's final harvest, right? We had kids saying, we have pumpkins and squash and apples. We have this abundance. And we give thanks for the many gifts that God gives us every day. All the while, we recognize that this time of abundance shepherds in the next season, winter, as fields lie frozen and barren, the skies turn gray. But we remember that in the midst of the frozen ground, the bulbs are prepared for spring. The snowfall replenishes our water supplies. And at a certain point, not too long from now, minute by minute, the days start to get longer. Everyday death and resurrection, held in the grace of God's hand. The cosmic rhythm of creation, formed by the one who loves.